At dinner, my wife lifted her glass, smirked, and said loud enough for the entire restaurant to hear, "You were my biggest mistake in my youth." I placed my napkin on the table, looked her straight in the eyes, and replied calmly, "Then I'll fix that now." Her friends laughed. She laughed louder. 3 days later, she was on her knees in my gallery, shaking, pale, whispering the same sentence over and over. "Shiloh, please, I didn't know." This is the story of those 3 days and the correction she never saw coming. Before we continue this chaotic cheating drama, take a second to subscribe, like, comment, and hit the hype button. It really helps this channel grow. The restaurant was called Meridian, one of those places where Seattle's art crowd gathered to be seen rather than to eat. White tablecloths, overpriced wine, walls covered in abstract paintings that meant nothing to anyone except the artists who created them. Brielle loved it here. She loved being admired, being recognized, being the center of attention in her flowing silk dress and carefully messy hair that took her 40 minutes to arrange each morning. I sat across from her, watching her hold court with Delilah Keene, her gossip friend who never missed an opportunity to encourage Brielle's worst impulses. They were discussing some gallery opening in Portland, their voices rising and falling with practiced drama. "Honestly," Brielle said, her second glass of wine already half empty, "the work was derivative at best. I told the curator as much." Delilah nodded enthusiastically. "You're so right. Your pieces have actual depth. Speaking of which, have you heard anything more from Los Angeles?" Brielle's eyes lit up. This was the topic she'd been waiting for all evening. "They're very interested. Very. The curator said my emotional rawness is exactly what they're looking for. This could be the show that finally establishes me independently." "Independently of what?" I asked quietly. She glanced at me as if suddenly remembering I was there. "Independently of being known as just another artist in your gallery, Shiloh. No offense." "None taken," I said, though we both knew that was a lie. Delilah leaned forward conspiratorially. "Brielle's work deserves to be in a major gallery. Not just, a local space." My gallery had been operating successfully for 9 years. It had launched the careers of 6 artists who now showed internationally. But to Delilah, and increasingly to Brielle, it was just a local space. "The Los Angeles opportunity," Brielle continued, her voice growing louder as the wine worked through her system, "represents everything I've been working toward. Real recognition, real validation, not just being featured because I'm married to the owner." Several nearby tables had turned to listen. Brielle noticed and seemed to feed off their attention. "You know what Silas said to me yesterday?" She didn't wait for anyone to answer. "He said my work reminds him of early Rothko, before Rothko became commercial, when he was still pure." I knew who Silas Ward was, a collector of rare musical instruments who had recently started attending art events, throwing money around like confetti, trying to buy his way into a world he didn't understand. I hadn't known Brielle was talking to him. "That's high praise," Delilah said. "Silas knows everyone in the high-end collecting world." "He does," Brielle agreed. "He's been incredibly supportive. He understands what I'm trying to accomplish as an artist." She looked at me then, and something in her expression had shifted. The wine, the attention, the imagined future in Los Angeles had combined to create a dangerous mixture of confidence and contempt. "Shiloh," she said, her voice carrying across the restaurant, "has always been steady, reliable, but you know what I realized recently?" "What's that?" Delilah asked, leaning in. "Marrying him was my biggest mistake in my youth." The words hung in the air like smoke. At nearby tables, conversation stopped. Delilah's eyes widened, then she laughed nervously. Brielle laughed too, louder, as if the statement had been a joke rather than a confession. I picked up my napkin, placed it carefully beside my plate, and looked at my wife. Really looked at her. At the woman I'd supported for 5 years, whose rent I'd paid before we married, whose studio supplies I still purchased, whose career I'd built through careful introductions and strategic placement in group shows. "Then I'll fix that now," I said quietly. Brielle blinked, her laughter faltering. "What?" "Your mistake. I'll correct it." I stood, placed $200 on the table to cover the bill and tip, and walked out of Meridian without looking back. Behind me, I heard Brielle say something to Delilah, heard them both laugh again, but the sound was different now, uncertain. Outside, the Seattle rain had started, that fine mist that soaks you before you realize you're wet. I stood on the sidewalk and made a decision. Not a hot, angry decision fueled by wounded pride. A cold, calculated decision born from years of observation and understanding. 3 days. That's all I would need. I'd suspected the affairs for 6 weeks before that dinner. Small things at first. Brielle coming home smelling of cologne I didn't wear. Unexplained charges on her credit card, the one I paid off each month. Phone calls she took in another room, her voice dropping to an intimate whisper I hadn't heard directed at me in over a year. The night after the Meridian dinner, I sat in my home office while Brielle slept off her wine in our bedroom. Her laptop sat on the desk where she'd left it, still open, password saved because she'd never imagined I'd look. I'm not proud of what I did next, but I'm not ashamed either. When someone tells you they've made a mistake marrying you, certain boundaries dissolve. Her email inbox told me everything. Messages from Silas Ward going back 3 months. They'd met at a charity auction where he'd purchased one of her smaller pieces for an absurdly inflated price. The correspondence had started professionally, then shifted. His messages were filled with praise for her talent, her vision, her independence. Hers were filled with complaints about being undervalued, misunderstood, trapped. Shiloh doesn't see me as an artist, she'd written. He sees me as an obligation. Silas had responded, a woman of your caliber needs someone who appreciates her complexity. I scrolled further. There were references to private dinners, to his collection of rare instruments she'd viewed at his home, to conversations that lasted until dawn. And then, buried in an email from 2 weeks ago. Once the Los Angeles show is confirmed, I'm leaving him. I can't build my future while anchored to my past. I sat back in my chair, the blue light of the laptop screen washing over my face. So that was the plan. Use my connections to secure the Los Angeles opportunity, then leave me for a wealthy collector who could provide the lifestyle and validation she craved. I opened another folder. Messages to Delilah were easier to find because Brielle emailed her constantly. Their correspondence read like a gossip column, full of judgments about other artists, complaints about their partners, speculation about who was sleeping with whom. But one thread caught my attention. References to someone named Corbin. The messages were vague but suggestive. Delilah asking, "How was your session yesterday?" Brielle responding with cryptic comments about stress relief and keeping things compartmentalized. I closed the laptop and stared at the wall of my office. The wall where I'd hung one of Brielle's early paintings, a piece she'd created during our first year together. It showed a couple walking through rain, their figures rendered in bold, confident strokes. She'd titled it Partnership. I took it down and placed it in the closet, face against the wall. The next morning I went to my gallery early. Ezra Latimer, my photographer friend, was already there setting up lighting for a new installation. "You look tired," he said without preamble. Ezra was good at reading faces. It's what made his portraits so compelling. "Didn't sleep well," I admitted. "Brielle?" I nodded. Ezra knew enough about my marriage to guess. He'd been at enough gallery events, witnessed enough of Brielle's dismissive comments, seen enough of the dynamic between us. "Want to talk about it?" "Not yet, but I might need your help with something in the next few days." Ezra studied me for a long moment. "All right, whatever you need." I spent that morning doing something I'd been avoiding for months. I made phone calls. Quiet, professional calls to other gallery owners, to collectors I'd worked with for years, to critics who trusted my judgment. I didn't gossip. I didn't accuse. I simply asked questions. "Have you heard anything about authenticity concerns in the local art scene? Are you familiar with Silas Ward's collecting habits? What's your impression of artists who build their careers primarily through personal relationships rather than merit?" Each conversation planted a seed, nothing explicit, nothing actionable, just gentle suggestions that perhaps the art world was becoming too influenced by connections rather than talent. By noon, I'd created a subtle web of doubt that would grow over the next 48 hours. That afternoon, I found what I needed about Corbin Brooks. His social media was public, full of photos from the gym where he worked as a personal trainer, but more interesting were the tagged photos. Brielle appeared in several, always captioned with something innocuous like "great training session" or "pushing limits today." Except Brielle didn't go to that gym. Her membership was at a different facility, one closer to our house, and in the photos, she wasn't wearing workout clothes. She was wearing the same outfits I'd seen her leave the house in on days she claimed to be working in her studio. I found his phone number through the gym's website, called and left a message saying I was interested in personal training sessions. Could he call me back to discuss rates? He did within an hour. His voice was young, confident, probably used to charming clients into expensive packages. "I'm actually calling about something else," I said calmly. "I'm Shiloh Trenwell. I believe you know my wife, Brielle." The silence on the other end lasted 3 seconds too long. "I'm not sure what you mean," he finally said. "I think you are. But that's fine. You're going to receive some information in the next day or two. What you do with it is your choice, but I thought I should give you context first. My wife has been telling you she's separated from me, hasn't she?" Another pause. Man, I don't want any trouble. Then you should probably know she's also been having a relationship with a collector named Silas Ward, and that she's not separated. She lives in my house, sleeps in my bed, and spends my money. I just thought you deserved to know who you're dealing with. I hung up before he could respond. It wasn't revenge, not yet. It was construction, building the framework for what would come next. That evening, Brielle came home late again, her hair damp from a shower she'd taken somewhere else. She kissed my cheek absently, poured herself wine, and disappeared into what she called her studio, a spare bedroom filled with canvases in various states of completion. I sat in the living room and continued my work, quiet work, the kind that happens in emails and text messages, in careful professional language that suggests without accusing, that questions without attacking. By midnight, 6 key collectors in Seattle's art scene had received messages from me expressing concerns about maintaining the integrity of the local art community. By morning, those concerns would spread through their networks like cracks in old paint. 3 days, I'd told myself. This was day 1. Day 2 started with Brielle's phone ringing at 7 in the morning. She answered it in the bathroom, her voice rising with each sentence until she was nearly shouting. What do you mean you're pulling my pieces? Shiloh, what are you talking about? I was in the kitchen making coffee. I didn't respond. She burst out, her phone clutched in her hand, her face pale. Your assistant just called me. She said you've removed all my paintings from the gallery. Why would you do that? Quality control, I said, pouring my coffee with steady hands. There have been some questions raised about consistency in your recent work. Questions? What questions? From whom? Various sources. Collectors, mostly. They've noticed some discrepancies. That's ridiculous. My work has never been more consistent. Silas just said yesterday that my latest pieces are the strongest I've ever done. I took a sip of coffee. Silas Ward isn't an art critic. He's a collector with more money than taste. His opinion, while flattering, isn't exactly authoritative. Brielle's hands were shaking now. Whether from anger or fear, I couldn't tell. You're jealous. You're jealous because I'm finally getting recognition beyond your little gallery. Your pieces were in my gallery because I put them there, I said calmly. Every sale, every review, every opportunity came through connections I built over a decade. But you're right. It's time for you to establish yourself independently. Consider this the first step. You can't do this. I already have. She stared at me for a long moment, then grabbed her jacket and stormed out. I knew where she was going. To Delilah, to cry and complain and seek validation. That was fine. It was part of the plan. An hour later, I arrived at the gallery to find Ezra waiting outside. This is happening then, he said. It wasn't a question. It is. Need my help? This afternoon, around 3. I need you to photograph something for me. He nodded and didn't ask questions. That's what made Ezra valuable. He understood the art world, understood how reputations were built and destroyed, understood that sometimes documentation was more powerful than confrontation. At 10 o'clock, I made a phone call to Los Angeles. The curator who'd expressed interest in Brielle's work answered on the second ring. Her name was Miranda Chen, and we'd met twice at art fairs over the years. Shiloh, she said warmly. Good to hear from you. What can I do for you? I'm calling about Brielle Trenwell. I understand you've been in contact with her about a possible exhibition. We have. Her emotional intensity is quite compelling. We're considering her for a group show next spring. I see. Miranda, this is difficult for me, but I'd be failing in my professional responsibility if I didn't mention some concerns. I could hear the shift in her tone. What kind of concerns? Brielle and I are married, which you may know. What you might not know is that she's been involved in some situations that raise questions about her professional judgment, multiple overlapping relationships with collectors and others in the art community, questions about whether her work is being promoted based on merit or on personal connections. I'm not making accusations, just suggesting that due diligence might be worthwhile. Silence on the other end. Then, I appreciate you telling me this. It's not the kind of information we usually get from a spouse. I'm a gallery owner first, I said. My reputation depends on honesty. I thought you deserved the same courtesy. We spoke for 5 more minutes. I provided no specifics, made no direct accusations. I simply suggested that the art community was smaller than people thought, and that professional entanglements had a way of becoming public knowledge at inconvenient times. When I hung up, I knew the Los Angeles exhibition was finished. Miranda was too smart, too protective of her gallery's reputation, to risk associating with an artist who came with complications. The rest of the morning I spent drafting an email. It took me 3 hours to write 2 paragraphs. The message needed to be perfect, devastating in content, but professionally neutral in tone. By noon, I was ready. I opened an anonymous email account and sent Silas Ward a carefully curated collection of screenshots, messages between Brielle and Corbin, messages between Brielle and Delilah discussing both Silas and Corbin, messages where Brielle described Silas as useful and Corbin as convenient. I included no commentary, no explanation. Just the evidence, time-stamped and clear. Then I waited. At 2:30, my phone rang. An unfamiliar number. I answered. "This is Silas Ward." His voice was tight with barely controlled rage. "I don't know who you are or how you got this information, but I want to speak with you." "I'm simply someone who believes in transparency," I said. "You sent me messages about Brielle Trenwell." "I sent you the truth. She's been sleeping with a personal trainer, and while I've been introducing her to every important collector on the West Coast, it appears that way." There was a long silence. When Silas spoke again, his voice was colder. "Do you know what I can do to her career?" "I'm counting on it," I said, and hung up. Ezra arrived at 3 o'clock as planned. Together we spent 2 hours in the gallery's back room, preparing what I'd come to think of as the final installation. Ezra photographed, I arranged. By 5 o'clock we were done. "This is going to destroy her," Ezra said quietly. "Yes," I agreed. "It is." That evening, Brielle didn't come home. Her phone went to voicemail every time I called. At 9 o'clock, Delilah posted a vague message on social media about toxic people and necessary distance. The art community was small. People would read between the lines. At 10, I received a text from an unknown number. "Tomorrow, your gallery. We need to talk. SW." I responded, 6 o'clock. The correction was almost complete. One more day. Day 3 arrived with gray skies and the promise of rain. Seattle weather matching Seattle moods. I spent the morning at the gallery, making final preparations. Ezra came by briefly, checked the installation one last time, then left without speaking. Some things didn't need words. At noon, I sent Brielle a text. "We need to talk. Gallery at 6. Please come." She responded immediately. "About what?" "About correcting mistakes," I wrote back. Then I made phone calls. Personal invitations to 8 specific people, key collectors who'd purchased work from my gallery over the years, 2 art critics who'd reviewed shows I'd curated, and Silas Ward, who I knew would come without needing an invitation. "Private viewing," I told each of them. "New installation, 6 o'clock, invitation only." By 4 o'clock, everything was ready. The gallery's main room had been transformed. The usual paintings were gone, replaced by a single wall installation that dominated the space. Ezra's photographs, printed large format, arranged in a precise grid. Between them, text panels printed in clean, readable fonts. Everything documented, everything true. I'd titled it Unfaithful Brushstrokes. At 5:30, I made coffee, set out wine glasses, adjusted the lighting so the installation would be perfectly visible but not harshly illuminated. This wasn't about shock value, it was about clarity. The first guests arrived at 10 minutes to 6. The Hendersons, collectors who'd purchased 3 of Brielle's paintings over the past 2 years, based on my recommendation. They looked around the empty gallery with confusion. "Where's the new work?" Mrs. Henderson asked. "You're looking at it," I said, gesturing to the wall. They moved closer, and I watched their expressions change as they began to read. First confusion, then recognition, then something between fascination and horror. More guests arrived. The critics, Delilah's husband Mark, who'd come without knowing his wife, was part of the story. 2 other gallery owners I'd worked with for years. Each one gravitated to the wall, drawn by that human compulsion to witness complicated truths. The installation told a story through evidence, photographs of texts and emails with only the relevant parts highlighted. Brielle's conversations with Silas about leaving me once the Los Angeles show was secured. Her messages to Corbin arranging their meetings, using language that made the physical nature of their relationship impossible to deny. Her text to Delilah mocking both men, describing Silas as desperate and Corbin as low effort. But the centerpiece was a large print of her own words, the message she'd sent Delilah 3 weeks ago. "Shiloh is useful until I don't need him anymore. Then I'm gone. I can't wait to be free of this boring life." At 6:15, Brielle arrived. She walked through the gallery door and stopped immediately. Her eyes scanned the room, taking in the assembled guests, their serious faces, the way they all stood near the installation wall. She looked at me last. "What is this?" she asked. "Correction," I said simply. She moved toward the wall slowly, like someone approaching a car accident. I watched her face as she read, watched the color drain from her cheeks, watched her hands begin to shake, watched her mouth open and close without sound. "You can't," she finally whispered. "You can't do this." "I already have." At that moment, Silas Ward walked in. He didn't greet anyone, didn't acknowledge the other guests. He walked straight to the installation wall and stood there reading every word, his jaw clenched so tight I could see muscles jumping in his neck. Brielle saw him and made a small sound, something between a gasp and a sob. "Silas, I can explain." He turned to face her. "Explain what? That you've been playing me for 3 months? That while I was introducing you to every important collector I know, while I was talking about your work at every event I attended, while I was buying your paintings for 3 times their actual value, you were mocking me to your friends and sleeping with a gym trainer?" "It wasn't like that." "It's exactly like that. It's documented right here." He gestured to the wall. "Your own words, your own descriptions of how useful I was, how desperate I seemed, how easy I was to manipulate." Brielle looked around the room desperately. The other guests were watching with the kind of intense attention usually reserved for performance art. This was better than any exhibition they'd seen in years. This was real. "Shiloh," she said, turning to me, "please, don't do this. We can talk about this privately." "We did talk," I said calmly. "At Meridian, remember? You told me I was your biggest mistake. That was our private conversation. This is the public correction." Silas stepped forward. "You want to know what I'm going to do?" he said to Brielle. "I'm going to make sure every serious collector on the West Coast knows exactly who you are. Every gallery owner, every curator, every critic. Your name will be associated with one thing: opportunistic manipulation. Nobody will touch your work. Nobody will risk their reputation by association." "You can't," Brielle said, her voice breaking. "Watch me." He turned to the room. "For anyone here who's purchased her work based on my recommendation, I apologize. I was deceived. If you want to return the pieces, I'll buy them back at full price. I won't let my poor judgment affect your collections." Mrs. Henderson spoke up. "We'll take you up on that, Silas. Thank you." 2 other collectors nodded agreement. I watched years of Brielle's career evaporate in seconds. Every piece sold, every placement in a collection, every small step toward legitimacy was being erased. Brielle looked at me with desperate eyes. "You've destroyed everything." "No," I said. "You did that yourself. I just documented it." Delilah's husband Mark stepped forward, his phone in his hand. "Is this why Delilah's been so stressed lately? She knew about all of this?" "She encouraged most of it," I said, gesturing to a section of the installation that showed Delilah's messages. "Your wife spent considerable time helping Brielle coordinate her affairs and plan her departure." Mark's face went hard. He left without another word, his phone already at his ear. Brielle sank into one of the gallery's chairs, her head in her hands. She was crying now, harsh sobs that shook her shoulders. But nobody moved to comfort her. The assembled guests simply stood there, bearing witness to the collapse of a carefully constructed image. One of the critics, a woman named Patricia, who'd written favorably about Brielle's work in the past, approached me. "This is brutal," she said quietly. "But honest. That's rare in this world." "I just believe in transparency," I said. She nodded slowly. "I'll need to write a retraction of my previous review. Given this context, I clearly misread her work's emotional authenticity." "That's your decision," I said. "It is, but it's the right one." The other guests began to leave, each one taking a last look at the installation, their faces thoughtful. They'd come expecting art. They'd gotten truth instead. In the art world, that was more valuable. Finally, only Silas, Brielle, and I remained. Silas looked at me for a long moment. "I should hate you for this. But you don't. No, you did me a favor. A painful one, but a favor nonetheless." He glanced at Brielle with something like pity. I hope the attention was worth it. He left, the gallery door closing with a soft click behind him. Brielle lifted her head. Her makeup had run, her eyes were swollen, her carefully constructed appearance completely undone. "The Los Angeles show?" "Called it off this morning. They received some concerning information about your professional ethics." "My work with other galleries?" "They'll follow Silas's lead. You're toxic now. That's how this world works. You knew that. You just thought you were clever enough to play the game without consequences." She stood on shaky legs. "I have nowhere to go." "That's not my problem anymore." "Shiloh, please, I'm sorry. I'll do anything. I'll change. I'll be better. Just please don't leave me with nothing." I walked to where she stood and looked at her clearly for the first time in months. Really looked at who she was underneath the performance. I saw someone who'd never learned that actions have weight, that words leave marks, that people aren't endlessly forgiving. "You said I was your biggest mistake," I said quietly. You said it in public, in front of your friends, loud enough for strangers to hear. You meant to humiliate me, to make yourself feel powerful and important. You wanted everyone to know you were leaving me behind, climbing to something better. I was wrong. I was so wrong. Yes, you were, but not about me being a mistake. You were right about that. I was a mistake for you because I believed in you when you didn't deserve it. I supported you when you should have failed. I gave you opportunities you never earned. The mistake wasn't marrying me. The mistake was me thinking you were worth the investment. I stepped back and gestured to the installation on the wall. This is your legacy now, not your paintings, not your exhibitions. This, a documentation of who you really are when nobody's performing for anyone. You wanted to be known as an artist. Congratulations. You're unforgettable now. Brielle opened her mouth, but nothing came out. What could she say? Everything on that wall was true. Every message was hers. Every decision was documented. You need to leave, I said. Take whatever you want from the house. I'll be staying elsewhere for a few days to give you time. But when I come back, I want you gone. Completely. Where will I go? Call Delilah. Oh wait, you can't. Her husband just found out she helped you cheat on me. Maybe try Silas. Except he's going to spend the next 6 months destroying your reputation. Corbin, perhaps? Though I suspect he's not interested in anything beyond what you are already giving him. I walked to the gallery door and opened it. Cool evening air rushed in, carrying the smell of rain. This is the correction you asked for, I said. At Meridian, you told me I was a mistake. You wanted me to fix it, so I did. I corrected every assumption you had about yourself, about your talent, about your future. You're free now. Free of my gallery, my connections, my support, my money. Free to build your career independently, exactly like you wanted. You should be grateful. Brielle walked toward the door like someone moving through deep water. When she reached me, she stopped. I loved you once, she whispered. No, I said. You loved what I could do for you. There's a difference. I just finally learned to see it. She walked out into the Seattle evening. I watched her figure disappear into the mist, becoming smaller and less distinct until she was gone completely. I closed the gallery door and locked it. The installation remained on the wall, visible through the large front windows. Anyone walking past could see it. By tomorrow, everyone would know the story. The art community was small. News traveled fast. I looked at the wall one last time. Unfaithful brushstrokes. My finest curation yet. Not because it was beautiful, but because it was true. You said I was your biggest mistake in your youth. I corrected it.